She lost her job on the last shift, and less than an hour later, 2 Blackhawks came for the nurse they said they could not replace. If you have ever been punished for doing the right thing, ignored when you knew you were right, or forced to walk away in silence while the system protected itself, this story will hit deeper than you expect. At dawn, in a Phoenix hospital, Claire Bennett stood in wrinkled scrubs, coffee dried on her sleeve, termination papers folded in her pocket, and 15 minutes left before security walked her out. She thought the worst part was over. Then the windows began to shake. What happened next was not just a rescue mission. It was a reckoning. Stay with me, because this story is about courage betrayal, and the kind of skill the world only values when lives are on the line. Like the video and comment where you're watching from. The first tremor in the windows made everyone look up. But for Claire Bennett, the real beginning had happened hours earlier in an office where the sun was just starting to touch the skyline and a man behind a polished desk had already decided who she was. At 6:20 that morning, Claire stood in the executive wing of St. Catherine Regional Medical Center with yesterday's navy scrubs still clinging to her skin. The fabric at the shoulders was stiff with dried sweat. There was a faint coffee stain near her left elbow. Her hair had slipped loose from its knot sometime around 4 in the morning, and she had not bothered fixing it. Night shift had a way of stripping everyone down to the truth. By sunrise, people stopped pretending they were made of anything stronger than caffeine and momentum. Thomas Whitaker liked his office cold. It was the kind of cold that came from central air, set lower than necessary because power in certain men always needed to be felt physically. The room smelled faintly of leather printer toner and whatever expensive cologne he used to separate himself from the world of antiseptic and blood 3 floors below. The city of Phoenix glowed beyond the glass-pale orange morning, spreading across rooftops and parking structures, but inside the office, the light felt thin and artificial. Whitaker sat behind his desk with both hands resting neatly on a manila folder. Her file. There was a printed label on the tab, black letters on white stock. Claire Bennett, RN. He had arranged the papers precisely. The incident report. The administrative notice. The termination letter. Claire had seen triage boards with more humanity. He looked up at her over rimless glasses and spoke in the patient tone people used when they wanted to sound reasonable while doing something cruel. Your instincts do not override hospital protocol, Miss Bennett. Claire did not answer. She stood with her weight evenly balanced shoulders square, eyes fixed somewhere just past him. She had learned a long time ago that silence unsettled certain people more than argument ever could. Whitaker was one of them. Men like him relied on resistance. Resistance gave them a stage. Silence forced them to hear themselves. He tapped the folder once. We have procedures for a reason. Chain of command. Physician supervision. Documentation. You bypassed every level of that process. Still nothing from Claire. Outside, the city brightened. Early traffic caught sunlight like sheets of metal. Somewhere below the 6th floor, a gurney wheel squealed. Life continued in layers indifferent to what happened in private offices. Whitaker cleared his throat and opened the folder. He looked down as if reading from scripture. The report states that you performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization, without attending oversight, and without imaging confirmation. He glanced up, giving her a chance to explain herself. A chance to ask for grace. A chance to soften. Claire gave him none of those things. The patient lived, she said. Whitaker leaned back a fraction. He had expected defiance or apology. The quiet certainty in her voice irritated him more. That is not the issue. No, Claire said. It never is. The edge in his jaw hardened. He set his glasses aside with slow care. The issue is that medicine is not practiced by impulse. Claire finally met his eyes. Hers were gray clear and too tired for anger to look dramatic. It was not impulse. He spread one hand over the report. You inserted a needle into a patient's chest with no attending present. She was dying. The fellow had ordered additional imaging. She did not have time for additional imaging. You were not the physician in charge, and he was not the one watching her blood pressure collapse in real time while he waited for a prettier picture. The words landed between them and stayed there. Not loud, not emotional. Worse than that. Precise. Whitaker's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. He turned the page as though paper could restore control. Claire let her gaze drift past him to the framed certificates on the wall. Leadership excellence. Administrative distinction. Strategic healthcare management. Not one thing in that room had ever pushed epinephrine through shaking fingers or counted compressions while a family cried outside a curtain. Not one frame on that wall knew the smell of a chest cavity filling with blood. Her mind slid back not because she wanted it to, but because the body keeps the exact shape of certain moments. An hour earlier, the emergency department had been running on fumes. The night had been full from the start. A rollover on Interstate 10, a meth-induced psychosis in Bay 4, an asthmatic child who arrived blue around the mouth and left breathing again because Brooke Dawson had moved like lightning with respiratory. By 5 in the morning, the charge board was crowded. The coffee was burned, and everyone had that hollowed-out look that comes before the handoff to day shift. Then the paramedics rolled in with Helen Mercer, 58. Sudden chest pain, severe shortness of breath, hypotensive in the field, diaphoretic, altered on arrival. The ambulance doors opened and the sound changed around the room. Claire had noticed that before. Truly sick patients altered the acoustics. People spoke sharper. Rubber soles moved faster. Machines seemed louder. Helen Mercer looked like she was drowning on dry land. Her skin was gray beneath the fluorescent lights. Her blouse had been cut down the front. EKG leads were already stuck across her chest. Her breathing came in tight, panicked bursts that did not seem to fill anything. One hand clawed weakly at the sheet as if she were reaching for the edge of a cliff. Pressure 80/40 and falling, one paramedic called out. Pain started 30 minutes ago, said the other. Near syncope in the rig. No known trauma. No allergy list on hand. The cardiology fellow, fresh from a call room that still smelled of bad sleep, stepped in with his ultrasound. He was intelligent, polished, and visibly irritated at being asked to make life-or-death decisions before sunrise. Claire had worked with his type before. Excellent test takers, fragile under uncertainty. He placed the probe and frowned at the screen. Suboptimal view. Hold still, ma'am. I need a better window. Helen's eyes fluttered wildly. Her lips moved around words that would not form. Claire stood at the bedside, one hand on the rail, and watched everything that mattered. The monitor, the neck veins, the pulse quality, the color draining from the patient's face. She was not listening for the clean answer. She was listening for the wrongness beneath the noise. The wrongness was familiar. Engorged neck veins, falling pressure, muffled cardiac tone under all the room noise. The way Helen's body seemed to be fighting something inward, not outward. Not a vessel burst, not a simple infarct. Compression. Pressure where pressure should never live. Cardiac tamponade. The fellow adjusted the probe again. I'm not happy with this image. Claire looked at the monitor, then at Helen's chest, then at the blood pressure cycling again and coming back lower. She's crashing, Claire said. The fellow did not look up. I said, I need a better image. There is fluid around the heart. We do not have confirmation. Claire heard the flat line of panic rising in the room, not from the patient, from the people around her. The kind that came when authority lagged behind reality. The nurses were ready. Brooke already had a tray half opened. Respiratory stood waiting. The resident on the other side of the bed looked toward the fellow and then toward the attending board looking for a decision that was not coming fast enough. Helen Mercer's gaze found Claire's. There are moments when fear strips the social world away. No titles, no policies, no hallway politics. Just one human being silently asking another not to let them go under. Claire's hand moved before anyone granted permission. She reached for the thoracentesis kit from the crash cart, pulled on sterile gloves, and tore open drapes with a motion so practiced it looked like memory rather than thought. Brooke stared at her for half a second, then pivoted without needing to be asked. "Betadine," Claire said. Brooke handed it over. The fellow straightened. "What are you doing?" Claire swabbed the skin in 3 fast strokes. "Saving her. Do not insert that needle." Claire ignored him. Her fingers found the landmark between rib and cartilage, the angle a body remembers after enough times standing close to irreversible loss. This was not the Arizona Board of Nursing speaking through her hands. It was something older than policy. Skill pressed into muscle by repetition and consequence. The room held its breath. Helen whimpered once. Claire inserted the needle. 1 second. 2. Then dark blood rushed into the syringe. Not arterial spray, not confusion. Release. The monitor tone changed first. Blood pressure climbed in hesitant increments. Helen's eyes sharpened. Her chest expanded with a real breath. The resident whispered, "Oh my God." The fellow froze with the ultrasound still in his hand, staring at the proof he had failed to recognize in time. Claire kept one hand steady, body still, voice quiet. "You're all right, Helen. Stay with me. Keep breathing." Helen stared at her like a woman pulled back from deep water. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. She nodded once, too weak to speak. Then the attending surgeon walked in. He took in the scene in a single sweep. The kit, the syringe, the drop in chaos. The fellow standing rigid with embarrassment. "Who authorized this?" he snapped. No one answered immediately. Claire did not look up. "I did." The attending's face darkened. He moved closer, fury and alarm colliding in his expression. "You do not perform blind procedures in my department." Claire finally lifted her eyes. "You do when waiting kills the patient." Those few words had traveled all the way to Whitaker's office. By the time the sun came up, Helen Mercer was alive, stable, and headed to ICU. The fellow had written the report like a man scrubbing himself clean. The attending had signed off with clipped, careful language that protected hierarchy first and outcome second. Whitaker had arrived early, which meant the complaint had moved faster than breakfast. Now in the office, he drew a slow breath. "This is not the first time you've gone outside protocol." Claire's mouth barely moved. "No." He sat forward, encouraged by the admission. "We have previous notes in your file. Unilateral decisions. Escalation without approval. Independent action in high-risk situations." Claire almost smiled at the elegance of the wording. It made life-saving sound like a behavioral issue. "You mean I see trouble early? I mean, you do not understand your place in a system." That got her attention. "My place?" she repeated. Whitaker mistook the quiet in her voice for weakness. "Yes. Healthcare is collaborative. No one person decides alone." Claire looked down at his desk, at his folded hands, at the expensive pen lined parallel to the edge of the blotter. "Last night, she said one person decided to keep Helen Mercer alive while everyone else waited for coverage." He pushed the termination paper toward her. "You created extraordinary liability for this hospital. She has a pulse. That is not a legal defense." Claire let out a soft breath through her nose. It was not quite a laugh. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "We are offering you a professional courtesy. 2 weeks severance. We will process this as a resignation for personal reasons. You will turn in your badge downstairs before you leave the building." He expected anger then. A raised voice, a plea. She gave him neither. Claire reached out, took the paper, and folded it once with deliberate care. Then again. She slid it into the scrub pocket over her hip. "Where do I leave the narcotic keys?" she asked. Whitaker blinked. "Security desk." For a second, something almost human crossed his face. Discomfort, perhaps. The faint shame of a man who knows he is protected by the distance between consequence and decision. "For what it's worth," he said, "you are a capable nurse. In a different environment, maybe one with more flexibility, you might do well." Claire held his gaze. "In a different environment, maybe you would too." Then she turned and walked out. The administrative corridor was lined with framed posters about compassion, teamwork, and excellence. Smiling people in staged blue scrubs leaned over fake bedsides beneath slogans chosen by committee. Claire passed them without really seeing them. The carpet swallowed her steps. Somewhere a copier hummed. The elevator took too long, so she used the stairs. Each landing smelled different. Carpet and coffee near administration, bleach and hand sanitizer near med-surg, warm food and old grease on the level near the cafeteria. Hospitals were ecosystems of scent and fatigue. Claire had loved that once the way the building never truly slept, the way life and death traded places floor by floor, while dawn lit the parking lot. On the cardiac unit, Brooke Dawson sat under the glow of dual monitors, charting with one hand and rubbing her eyes with the other. Her dark ponytail had come halfway loose. She looked up when Claire approached and understood before a word was spoken. "No," Brooke said. Claire gave the smallest nod. Brooke pushed back from the station so fast her chair rolled into a cabinet. She came around the desk and pulled Claire into a hard hug that smelled like peppermint gum and hospital soap. "They didn't. They did." Brooke drew back furious already. "You saved her." Claire's expression softened in a way it never had in Whitaker's office. "I know." Brooke searched her face looking for the crack, the collapse, the thing that would let friendship do some repair. Claire did not have one to offer. Exhaustion had flattened all the visible edges. "Tell me Helen's okay," Brooke said. "She's stable. Watch her pressure. When they transition anticoagulation, make sure they do not push the timing too fast." Brooke nodded automatically. Even now, work first. Claire reached into her pocket and handed over 3 folded scraps of paper. "What's this?" "Notes for day shift." Brooke unfolded one. Mr. Landry in 412 gets confused when he wakes up to bright light. Approach from the left, speak before touching him. Another note. Mrs. Velasquez needs pain meds 30 minutes before therapy, or she will insist she is fine and tear her incision trying to prove it. Another. Room 418 pretends he is not short of breath because his wife panics when he says the word. Brooke's eyes filled. "You already handed off." "Not all of it." The nurse's station faded around them for a moment. Someone called for morning labs. A call bell sounded twice. Footsteps rushed past with a portable monitor. The world kept demanding small acts of competence from people it replaced too easily. Brooke folded the notes carefully and tucked them under the keyboard. "You could fight this." Claire's face went still. "No. Claire, she lived. That is why you should." Claire looked down the hallway toward the patient rooms. She would not walk again. "No, that is why I do not need to." She spent the next 20 minutes moving through the unit like a ghost with unfinished work. She checked one dressing, corrected one pump rate that had not yet become dangerous, and spoke softly to a frightened man waking from a nightmare. She did not announce herself. She did not dramatize her departure. She simply kept being useful until usefulness no longer belonged to her. At the end of the hall, an elderly woman in room 421 lifted a hand when Claire passed. "Nurse." Claire stepped in. The woman's voice shook. "Is it day already?" Claire glanced at the blinds, glowing pale gold. "It is. Will you still be here later?" A beat. Claire pulled the blanket higher around the woman's shoulders. "No, ma'am, but someone will." The woman studied her face with the strange clarity sick people sometimes have. "You look tired." Claire smiled, then faint and real. "I am. You did good tonight." Claire thought of blood in a syringe. Brooke's arms around her. Whitaker's polished desk. The old ache that comes when being right costs too much. "Yes," she said, "I did." The woman nodded, satisfied with something beyond explanation. Claire stepped out before the answer could break open further. Her locker was on the lower level near staff changing. Rows of dented metal doors, concrete floor, the sour smell of old coffee and disinfectant, a place no one photographed when they advertised the hospital. Inside her locker were the small fragments of a life lived between emergencies. A stethoscope with a worn rubber cuff, 3 pens, a tube of hand lotion, a spare phone charger, protein bar wrappers crushed into the back corner, a pair of compression socks she kept forgetting to take home, and taped inside the door, slightly crooked, was a photograph of Caleb Bennett, 17 years old, sunburned nose, baseball cap backward, grinning with the heedless confidence of someone who believed there would be time for everything. Claire peeled the photo carefully from the metal. For a moment, the room around her fell away. Not memory in sentences, memory in flashes. A rural road outside Flagstaff at dusk. An overturned truck in a drainage ditch. Glass glittering in weeds. Her mother screaming into a cell phone trying to explain where they were to a dispatcher who kept asking for cross streets that did not exist. Caleb on the gravel, shoulder blood soaking through a shirt someone had pressed against his side, trying to stay brave because his little sister was watching. 15-year-old Claire kneeling beside him with shaking hands, and no idea how to make the red stop, leaving him, his skin turning cold before help ever found them. That was the night something in her had hardened into purpose. Not ambition, not inspiration. Something cleaner and more ruthless. A refusal to ever stand useless beside dying again. The military had offered the fastest path to skill. Training, discipline, pressure. The chance to become the person who arrived in time. It had also taught her the cost of becoming that person. Claire slipped Caleb's photo into her bag. The staff lounge stood empty when she crossed through it on the way toward the elevator. A coffee pot hissed on a warmer. One overhead fluorescent buzzed louder than the others. On the far wall hung the memorial plaque for employees and service affiliates who had died in the line of duty. Nurses lost during the pandemic. A paramedic killed in a freeway collision. A respiratory therapist whose heart gave out after too many hours under too much strain. Claire had passed it 100 times without stopping. This time she did. At first it was just movement catching her eye, the way one photograph sat differently from the rest. Then her gaze focused, and the blood in her body seemed to withdraw from the edges inward. Captain Emily Shaw, United States Army. The framed portrait showed a woman in dress uniform with dark hair pinned back and a smile that had once meant steadiness under fire. Emily had commanded Raven 9 with the kind of authority that did not need theatrics. She had been the first officer Claire trusted and the last one she watched die. Emily Shaw had not been public record, not in any meaningful way. Operation Ash Lantern had gone black after the ambush. Names sealed, reports buried, families given partial truths. The surviving personnel scattered behind non-disclosure agreements and euphemisms about reassignment. Her name did not belong on a memorial wall in Phoenix. Claire stepped closer until she could see the faint scratches in the glass. "Who put you here?" she whispered. There was no answer. Only the air vent stirring old paper on the bulletin board and the distant ding of an elevator. She lifted her hand and touched the frame. The memory came hard. Desert wind carrying heat even after sunset. Emily Shaw crouched behind a crumbling wall rifle up calm in a storm of shouting, ordering the team to shift left while tracer fire stitched dust off the compound gate. Claire kneeling over a wounded man whose chest would not stay inflated. Emily turning her head just once to check on her people before the second explosion took the world apart. Claire pulled her hand back from the glass. Her pulse had climbed without permission. Not panic, recognition. The same cold alertness that used to settle over her before convoy movement and incoming fire. The body remembers long after the conscious mind negotiates truces with the past. Someone knew enough to place Emily there. Either by mistake, which was impossible, or by intention, which was worse. The security guard Whitaker had assigned to shadow her waited by the doorway pretending to study his phone. "You all right?" he asked. Claire turned too quickly for him not to notice. "Fine." He looked past her toward the wall, and then back again. "You need another minute." "No." She slung her bag higher on her shoulder and walked out into the hallway, but the building no longer felt like the building she had known. It felt observed. Not by cameras. By design. As if some unseen hand had shifted one piece on a board and was waiting to see whether she noticed. The lower-level stairwell smelled of dust and concrete. She pushed through the heavy door and started up toward the lobby rather than down. Old habit, when things felt wrong, higher ground. Better sight lines, more exits. At the second-floor landing, she stopped. A sound. Low, at first, almost beneath hearing. A vibration more than a noise. It traveled through the metal rail under her hand and up into her forearm. For one irrational second, she thought thunder, though Arizona had given them a clear sky all morning. Then the sound deepened. Rotor wash. Twin turbines. Military approach. Every muscle in her body went still. The stairwell door above banged open, and two techs came rushing down talking over each other. Something's landing on the roof. That is not life flight. Claire tightened her grip on the rail until the knuckles blanched. Not medical transport. Not news. Not police. The pitch was wrong. Too heavy. Too disciplined. She knew that sound from desert nights and half-lit landing zones marked with chem lights and blood. She moved up the stairs fast now, not running, not yet. By the time she reached the upper corridor, people were spilling from workstations and patient rooms pulled by alarm and confusion toward the windows facing the roof access doors. The first Blackhawk dropped into view like a shadow made solid. Matte, dark rotors chopping the dawn apart. Then the second. The glass shuddered. Ceiling panels rattled. A stack of clipboards slid off a counter and scattered across the floor. Someone shouted for security. Someone else started crying. The hospital intercom clicked alive. All staff remain calm and stay in your assigned areas. The lie in that sentence was so complete it almost made Claire smile. Then the second voice came over the speaker's male and crisp and impossible to mistake for hospital staff. "We are looking for Claire Bennett. Repeat. Claire Bennett, report to rooftop access immediately." The hallway fell silent all at once. Brooke, who had appeared out of nowhere at Claire's side, turned toward her slowly. "What did they just say?" Claire did not answer. The duffel slipped from her shoulder and hit the polished floor. Then the stairwell door exploded open. 6 soldiers entered in controlled formation tactical gear, catching the fluorescent light boots loud against tile. They spread with efficient precision, scanning faces, badges, body language. Not hostile, not hesitant. People trained to move through chaos without becoming part of it. The man at the front was tall, broad, through the shoulders. Hair clipped close eyes the color of gunmetal. His gaze traveled over the crowd once and locked on Claire like the rest of the room had ceased to exist. He crossed the distance between them. Brooke stepped instinctively half in front of Claire. The soldier stopped taking in the gesture without reacting to it. He was close enough now for Claire to see the patch on his sleeve. A black raven over 9 stars. Raven 9. The air in her lungs thinned. "Claire Bennett," he asked. His voice carried command, but there was something else under it. Respect, maybe. Or urgency refined by long practice into stillness. Claire looked at the patch again, then at his face. "Who are you?" "Master Sergeant Logan Voss." The name struck nothing in memory, which meant he was new blood. Younger than the unit she had served with. A generation touched by the aftershocks of missions he had never seen. Brooke looked from one to the other, bewildered. "What is this?" "She doesn't work for the military." Voss never took his eyes off Claire. "Ma'am, we have a critical casualty." Code Black. Colonel Nathan Cross is asking for the medic from Raven 9. The old name for the role settled into her like a blade sliding between ribs. Not nurse. Not clinician. Medic. Officially, Raven 9 had been buried with every record attached to it. Its dead were counted under other designations. Its survivors were absorbed, discharged, or instructed to disappear. Claire had done exactly that. She had changed states, changed sectors, changed the way she carried herself in public. She had built a life narrow enough to feel safe inside. And now, a patch she had not seen in 8 years was standing in a civilian hospital, calling her by the one thing she had worked not to be. Her mouth had gone dry. Nathan Cross is alive. Voss held her gaze, for the moment. The corridor had become a tableau of frozen witnesses. Nurses, residents, security. Whitaker himself had appeared at the far end, pale with outrage and confusion, still clutching the logic of the building like it might protect him. "This is a hospital," he called. "You cannot conduct military operations here." Voss turned his head just enough to acknowledge that sound existed. "We already are." Whitaker took a step closer, then stopped when he realized no one in tactical gear cared that he was the administrator. Claire could feel Brooke staring at her questions, stacking faster than words. Claire wished she had something to give her. An explanation. A simpler version. But the truth was not simple, and it did not belong to a hallway full of strangers. Voss lowered his voice. "We do not have much time." Claire looked around the corridor one last time. Brooke's stricken face. Whitaker's outrage. The nurses trying not to stare. The hospital that had spent the last hour deciding she was too dangerous to keep. Then she looked down at her bag on the floor. Inside were a stethoscope, Caleb's photo, and a folded termination notice. She bent, picked up the bag, and followed Master Sergeant Logan Voss toward the stairwell. Claire followed Master Sergeant Logan Voss into the stairwell as if stepping through a seam in the world. The noise hit harder there. Out in the corridor, the rotors had been thunder over glass and panic. Inside the concrete shaft, the sound turned physical. It pressed through the railings, climbed the walls, and settled in the bones. 2 soldiers moved ahead of them, 2 behind. Brooke stood at the doorway, above one hand braced against the frame, staring after Claire like she no longer recognized the woman she had worked beside all year. Claire looked back only once. Brooke's lips parted around a question she could not fit into words. Claire gave her the smallest nod. It was not reassurance. It was acknowledgement. A promise of nothing except that the moment was real. Then the soldiers kept moving and the hospital disappeared floor by floor beneath the pounding of rotor blades. The rooftop access door burst open under one soldier's hand. Wind slammed into them. The roof was chaos held together by training. Dust and paper spiraled in mad circles. A wheeled oxygen tank had been laid on its side and strapped down to keep it from rolling. Security officers crouched near the wall radios to their ears, faces pinched pale. The first Black Hawk sat hard on the pad, with its rotors still chewing the dawn into ribbons. The second hovered just beyond the roofline, then settled with brutal precision beside it. Claire had not stood this close to a military bird in 8 years. The smell hit her first. Burned fuel, hot metal, hydraulic fluid. Underneath it, the old, remembered tang of canvas sweat and something harsher the mind learns to associate with blood even when none is visible yet. The crew chief at the open door motioned them in with urgent, practiced irritation. No time for ceremony, no room for hesitation. Voss turned toward her, hand pressed to his headset to hear himself speak. "Watch your head. Stay low." Claire climbed aboard. The interior was all metal edges and restraint straps, no softness anywhere except what memory supplied. She slid into the nearest jump seat and buckled in by reflex before she registered that she had done it. Muscle memory moved through her hands faster than conscious thought. Across from her, Voss settled into place as the door slammed shut, and the outside world disappeared behind a vibrating wall of steel. The helicopter rose with a hard lurch. Phoenix fell away in pieces. Hospital roof, parking decks, the pale ribbon of freeway, rows of stucco subdivisions laid out like circuit boards in the early light. Claire watched the city tip and flatten through a small scratched window while the engine noise closed around them like another atmosphere. The soldiers beside her were younger than she expected. 24, maybe 25. Clean uniforms. Controlled faces. They stole quick glances at her and then away the way people look at something they have heard stories about but never expected to see in person. Voss pulled a headset from a storage pouch and handed it across. "Put this on." Claire fitted it over her ears. The roar softened into something navigable. Not quiet, just survivable. Voss tapped his own headset and his mouth moved. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." He nodded once and passed her a ruggedized tablet held together by scratches and military-issue stubbornness. We do not have much flight time, so I'm not going to waste any. Claire looked down at the screen. A scan image filled the display. Thoracic cavity. Fragment shadow. Measurements in clean white numerals. Colonel Nathan Cross Voss said. Penetrating chest trauma from metallic fragmentation. Initial intervention controlled the hemorrhage but not the pressure. He is unstable. Current estimate puts him inside a narrow window. Claire stared at the name. Nathan Cross. For one suspended second, she was no longer inside a Blackhawk over Arizona. She was back under a desert moon that looked too calm for the amount of blood soaking the ground beneath it. She could feel grit in her teeth, hear someone screaming for morphine, smell explosive residue and scorched electrical insulation. Cross had been on his knees then, trying not to collapse while his own blood filled the low places in his armor. She looked up from the tablet. He asked for me. Voss met her eyes directly, by name. How did he know where I was? He did not, Voss said. Not exactly. He had people looking, quietly, for years. It took a chain of bad luck and one very public hospital incident for the trail to sharpen. Claire's expression did not change, but the line of her jaw tightened. So they were watching. Voss did not flinch from the accusation. Watching is not the word I would use. It is the one I would. He accepted that without argument, and leaned closer so the conversation felt private, despite the others within arm's reach. He saw a flag in a system he knew too well. Nurse in Phoenix. Unauthorized, life-saving intervention. Pattern of action consistent with a field medic under extreme conditions. He pushed. Records moved, names aligned. Claire looked back at the scan. The fragment sat near the heart in a position that made her own chest feel constricted. It was not a clean wound. No obvious lane, no generous margin. This was the kind of injury that punished certainty. How long has he been down? 6 hours from impact to extraction. 2 since arrival at Fort Huachuca. They stabilized what they could. Who is operating now? Forward surgical team with cardiothoracic consult on secure feed. They have controlled the obvious losses. They have not touched the fragment. Claire swiped through the file. Vital signs, field notes, portable imaging, blood gas panels, pressure curves. Someone had done good work under bad constraints. She could see it in the documentation. The lines were messy numbers entered at odd intervals, but the thinking behind them was disciplined. What caused the injury? Convoy route outside the southern perimeter. Device in a retaining wall. Secondary fragmentation from chassis armor. Cross took the brunt. Claire kept reading. Cross had arrived conscious and combative. Declined sedation until his team confirmed the bird for Phoenix was in the air. That detail pressed somewhere behind her ribs. He was conscious enough to refuse sedation. Long enough? That sounds like him. Voss studied her face. You remember him clearly. Claire did not answer immediately. The helicopter banked slightly south sunlight sliding across the inside cabin wall in pulses through the small windows. I remember most people I have had to open up in the dirt, she said at last. That earned the faintest shift in his expression. Not shock, respect. He swiped the tablet to another scan and zoomed in. The image sharpened over the grain. This is the problem. Claire leaned forward. The fragment had lodged near the pericardium close enough that every heartbeat threatened to turn a stable position into catastrophe. A few millimeters one way and it would tear through tissue that gave you no second chance. Who read this, she asked. Our surgical chief. He thinks standard removal will kill him. Claire's thumb hovered over the image. He is probably right. Voss let that sit between them. He said, you would know what to do. Claire gave him a cold look, did he? Voss did not blink, yes. The aircraft shook through turbulence. One of the younger soldiers braced a hand against the bulkhead. Claire barely noticed. Her eyes stayed on the screen while her mind against her will unlatched the door she had kept bolted for 8 years. Operation Ash Lantern had begun with the confidence of a mission already decided on paper. Eastern Syria. A desert settlement too small for maps anyone trusted. Objective, clear, risk. Manageable extraction window narrow, but acceptable. Raven 9 had been tasked with securing a high-value source and pulling out before daylight exposed the route. Claire had been 24, and newly convinced that competence could keep pace with danger if you trained hard enough. Captain Emily Shaw had led the team. Emily had that rare quality real leaders carried, a center of gravity that steadied everyone around them. She never raised her voice unless distance required it. She never used rank as theater. Even in prep, even under time pressure, she made eye contact when she gave an order as if responsibility was not something she flung downhill, but something she laid carefully into another set of hands. On the flight in the cabin had been darker than this one, lit only by instrument spill and the dim red wash that made every face look hollowed out. Cross sat opposite Claire, then two checking route overlays with one gloved finger, while Emily spoke to the team over headset. Fast in, fast out. No improvisation unless the ground writes a different script. That had earned a grin from Staff Sergeant Owen Blake. Ground always thinks it is the writer, ma'am. Emily's mouth had twitched at one corner, then read quickly. Claire remembered adjusting the straps on her aid bag, checking equipment for the third time, feeling that electric quiet that comes just before movement. Beside her, Sergeant Megan Holt had leaned over and tapped Claire's knee. "You good?" Claire had nodded. Megan leaned back with a smirk. Liar. There had been laughter in that cabin. Tired laughter. Familiar laughter. The kind people make when fear has been around so long it no longer needs formal introduction. Then the aircraft touched down in a wash of sand and rotor blast, and the world narrowed to night vision green and route discipline. Boots on hard-packed ground. Hands on weapons. Claire, in the middle column aid bag, high on her spine crossed, trained enough to move with the unit without pretending she belonged anywhere but where the wounded would fall. The settlement had looked dead from a distance. That should have warned them. No dogs barking. No generators humming. No human rhythm behind the walls. Just silence laid too evenly across too many structures. Emily had stopped with one fist raised, and the whole column had frozen. Cross moved up on her left. They said nothing Claire could hear, but she saw the slight turn of Emily's head and knew something in the air had shifted. Then light exploded beneath the building ahead. Not a roadside device. Not a point charge. A structural trap. The blast lifted one wall in a white-orange bloom and turned the inside of the night into chaos. Dust punched through the alley. Someone shouted. Someone disappeared. The shockwave hit Claire in the chest and threw her backward into stone. For a moment, there was no world, just ringing and sand in her mouth and the violent certainty that everything had changed. When hearing came back, it brought screaming with it. Claire rolled coughed dust and found blood on her forearm that was not hers. Holt was dragging a wounded soldier behind a half-collapsed barrier. Blake was firing short-controlled bursts toward a roofline. Emily was on one knee, rifle-up voice steady in the middle of disaster, redirecting the living away from the dead. Cross had gone down near the blown-out wall. Claire reached him because reaching was what she had trained herself to do before thought finished forming. He was conscious, which almost made the damage worse. Conscious men looked at you. They knew enough to ask with their eyes whether this was survivable. His chest was a ruin of torn fabric armor fragments and blood too dark to be hopeful. Each breath came shallower than the one before it. Air bubbled where it should not. Blood filled the cavity faster than field dressings could make sense of. Somewhere under all of that, the heart still fought. "Cross?" Claire said, dropping hard to her knees beside him. "Look at me." He did. Barely. "Bennett." His voice had sounded like gravel dragged across metal. "You are not done," she told him. "You hear me." Another explosion cracked somewhere deeper in the compound. Claire tore open packaging with her teeth hands moving through sequence while her brain leaped ahead over anatomy and probability. She needed to relieve pressure. She needed to keep the lung from collapsing completely. She needed time for medevac they did not have. Emily dropped beside them for one fast second. How bad? Bad enough. Emily looked once at the wound, once at Claire. "Can you keep him alive?" Claire heard herself answer before doubt could shape itself. Yes. Emily nodded and rose into gunfire like she had delegated a task, not a life. Claire had worked by feel and fragments of memory. Field trauma training. Emergency improvisation. The stubborn intelligence of hands that refused to stop because stopping meant ownership of the outcome. She inserted a decompression needle, cleared what she could, used a chest tube in a way no one had taught because textbooks assumed walls like sterile drapes and a surgeon somewhere nearby. There had been no such luxury in that alley. Only Cross's breathing getting weaker and Claire's voice dragging him back each time he tried to slip under. "Stay with me." He coughed blood. She ignored the fear that flashed through her. "Cross, stay with me." His fingers had caught weakly at her sleeve once, then fallen away. She used a field cautery unit meant for equipment sealing to close a bleeder she could not otherwise stop. The smell had turned her stomach even then, but the bleeding slowed. When medevac finally arrived, she was soaked to the wrists and beyond tired, living on the far side of adrenaline where all motion becomes economy. Blake had helped lift Cross to the litter. Holt had looked at Claire's hands and then at the man still breathing because of them, and for one wild second there had been something like joy on a battlefield. Emily Shaw had not made that flight out. The rest of Ash Lantern unraveled under classification and consequence. Back in the Blackhawk over Arizona, Claire blinked once and the desert alley dissolved. Voss was watching her carefully. He was not old enough to have been there, but he carried himself like a man who had grown up in the stories of people who had. He waited for her to return fully before speaking again. "The procedure you improvised that night was studied after the mission." Claire looked at him. "Studied by whom?" "By command, medical review first. Then special operations trauma development. And my rapport suppressed." She laughed once under her breath. Not amusement, recognition. Voss continued because truth had momentum now. The mission became politically radioactive. Intelligence failure. Source corruption. Casualty optics. Your report was attached to all of it, and your findings got folded into a doctrine package under Cross's name because he survived, and because Command could sell the adaptation more easily through an officer than through an enlisted combat medic who was already asking hard questions. Claire stared at him until he had to hold that gaze like a burden. "They gave him my work. They gave the system your work," Voss said quietly. Cross never claimed it, did not stop him from wearing it. That landed harder than Voss expected. She saw it in the way his eyes shifted not away, but inward. He fought it, Voss said. Internally, he pushed for credit corrections for sealed addendums for witness statements. He got shut down every time. Then they offered him the usual choices. Stay useful or stay honest. Claire looked back at the tablet before he could see too much in her face. And what did he choose? Voss let out a breath that might have been the beginning of a bitter smile. He stayed alive long enough to keep pushing. The younger soldier beside Claire spoke for the first time, voice careful in the headset. "They teach it in trauma sustainment now, ma'am." Claire turned toward him. He straightened instinctively under her attention. "The Cross Protocol, Rapid Field Thoracic Salvage. We learned it in advanced rotation." The name sat wrong in her ears. "You learned it from a manual." "Yes, ma'am." "Did they tell you where it came from?" The soldier hesitated. "No, ma'am." Claire looked back out the small window. The land below had shifted from city grid to open tan and rust-long roads cutting through empty stretches that looked permanent, until you remembered how quickly the earth erased tracks in dry country. "How many lives?" she asked. Voss answered without checking. He had the number memorized. Confirmed direct saves through the protocol 247. Likely more, but that is the verified count. 247. The number did not comfort her. It opened in her mind like a room she had never been allowed to enter. Men and women alive because she had refused to let Cross die in a ruined alley. Families untouched by a knock at the door. Children who still knew a parent's voice. All of it built on a theft she had been forced to pretend not to notice. She closed the tablet for a moment and rested it against one knee. The interior of the Blackhawk pulsed with engine vibration. Sunlight flashed off a helmet buckle. Someone at the far end of the cabin crossed himself without thinking when the aircraft dropped suddenly and then leveled out. Claire lifted the tablet again. What has been attempted? The shift in her voice was immediate. Personal history sealed off. Clinical tempo restored. Voss recognized it and followed. Field decompression at scene. Initial transfusion en route. Surgical team placed drainage-controlled external bleeding stabilized pressure. They did not remove the fragment. Repeated imaging shows migration with each cardiac cycle. They can keep him alive for stretches. They cannot solve the problem. Claire swiped deeper into the images. The wound track was ugly and asymmetrical. The fragment had entered under an oblique angle, likely after ricochet through armor plating. Not clean enough for predictable extraction. Not stable enough for transport beyond a certain window. She zoomed in on the edge nearest the pericardium. He has fluid accumulation here. Yes. How much? Enough for concern. Not enough yet to call full tamponade. Yet. She leaned back and closed her eyes not to rest, but to map. Structures. Angles. Options. She could feel the old mental architecture returning rooms lighting up one by one after years in darkness. Field constraints. Tissue planes. Improvised access. Control first. Visibility if possible. If not possible, tactile read and disciplined risk. When she opened her eyes again, Voss was still watching. You said he asked for the medic from Raven 9. He did. Why not use my current name? Voss considered the answer before giving it. Maybe because that is the name of the person he trusted to save him. Not the one the rest of the world got after. Claire said nothing to that. The aircraft dipped lower. Through the window she caught the first signs of Fort Huachuca below. Long runways. Low buildings. Hard geometry in the desert. A place built for purpose, not beauty. Voss keyed his mic, listened, then looked back at her. 10 minutes. Claire handed the tablet back. No. Voss frowned. No. I keep it. Something almost like relief crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. She kept reading. Labs first, then medication timeline. Sedation intervals. Team notes. A brief typed summary from the surgical chief, clean and blunt. Not operable by conventional route under current conditions. Recommend palliative stabilization pending command decision. Claire reread that sentence once and set her jaw. One of the younger soldiers across from her asked before he could stop himself. Were you really there, ma'am? Voss shot him a warning look, but Claire answered. Yes. The soldier swallowed, with Raven 9. Yes. He glanced at the patch on his own sleeve as though it had suddenly become heavier. My uncle served with support detachment attached to your unit. He said there was a medic who kept people alive after Ash Lantern when nobody else thought they could be saved. Claire looked at his face, open, respectful. Too young to understand what legends cost the people trapped inside them. Your uncle tell you her name? The soldier shook his head. No, ma'am. Claire looked back to the window. That sounds right. No one spoke for the next several minutes. The helicopter dropped lower over the base. Vehicles shrank and then widened beneath them. Ants becoming machinery. Men becoming troops. The crew chief unlatched the side door before touchdown, and hot air knifed into the cabin with a force that smelled of dust fuel and old, sun-baked concrete. The landing came hard enough to jar teeth. Before the rotors slowed, the soldiers were already moving. Voss stood braced himself and pointed toward the opening. Stay with me. Claire rose, slung her duffel over one shoulder, and stepped into the wash. Fort Huachuca spread around her in floodlights and urgency. Ambulances, utility trucks, medics jogging between temporary structures. A litter team cutting across open ground. The whole place carried the unmistakable rhythm of a system under pressure but not yet broken. This was not the civilian order of a regional hospital. This was battlefield medicine dragged onto domestic soil wearing a cleaner face and the same desperate heartbeat. Voss led her off the pad and through a cordon of waiting personnel. Nobody saluted. Nobody asked for credentials. People moved out of her path the way they moved for necessity when they recognized it. Claire adjusted the duffel on her shoulder and kept walking. Ahead, beyond the wash of lights and the blur of motion, the trauma bay doors stood open. The closer Claire got, the more the air changed. Hospitals hid their panic behind walls, closed doors, and voices trained to stay even. Places like this had no such luxury. Urgency lived out in the open. She could hear it in boot steps, striking concrete at different speeds and clipped orders moving across the yard and the metallic rattle of carts pushed too fast over uneven ground. Inside the first triage structure, a young medic was cutting away a uniform sleeve, while another hung blood from a portable pole. Two litters stood side by side. One patient was conscious and cursing through clenched teeth. The other stared upward with the stillness of a man already going somewhere the team around him refused to let him reach. The smell was stronger here. Saline, sweat, antiseptic. Blood warmed by canvas and human heat. Claire walked through it without slowing. No one stopped her. That, more than anything, told her how bad Cross had to be. Military medicine loved gate slayers' permissions. Those vanished only when time had already started closing in. Voss led her through a second set of doors into a narrower corridor, lined with supply lockers and hard plastic chairs no one was sitting in. A nurse in desert camo glanced up from a chart, took one look at Claire's face and stepped aside before Voss said a word. At the far end, the trauma bay opened under bright surgical lights. Claire saw Megan Holt first. Megan stood at a scrub sink with both forearms wet to the elbow, surgical cap tied too tight over blonde hair she had once worn braided down her back under a helmet. She turned at the sound of the door, impatient, ready to tell someone to move. Then her eyes landed on Claire. Everything in her face stopped. For one suspended second, the years between them vanished. Not because time had not done its work, but because recognition does not ask permission before it hits. Megan's mouth parted. Water continued running over her hands while she stared. Claire. The name came out like something pulled from a grave. Claire had imagined this moment in distorted flashes over the years. A grocery store by accident, an obituary, a name on a secure roster she was never supposed to read. Never this. Never bright lights and blood and a colonel fighting for his life in the next room. Megan. Megan shut off the water with her elbow and crossed the room so fast she nearly clipped a metal tray. She stopped only when she was inches away, as if the final step required confirmation from a reality still catching up. We were told you signed out and vanished. That is one way to say it. Megan looked at her with wet eyes, and a medic's ruthlessness taking inventory the way old teammates did. Height the same. Shoulders a little more guarded. New lines at the corners of the eyes. No ring, no visible injury. Still standing. Then Megan grabbed the back of Claire's neck and pulled her into a fierce, fast embrace that lasted half a second, and said everything words could not afford to. When they separated, another voice came from the far side of the bay. I knew it. Owen Blake stepped out from behind a privacy screen with gloves snapped at his wrists and blood on the front of his gown. He was broader now, hair thinned at the temples, his face bearing the carved-in fatigue of a man who had kept showing up long after charm stopped being part of the job. But his eyes were the same. Dry wit, sharp intelligence, and the habit of measuring exits before anyone else noticed they might matter. He gave Claire one long look and shook his head once. You look better than the rumors. Claire glanced at the blood on his gown. You look busy. His grin flashed for a second and was gone. Cross is in there. The curtain shifted and the room narrowed to the shape of the bed. Colonel Nathan Cross lay under the harsh white glow of portable surgical lamps, one side of his chest already prepped and draped. Monitors framed him in restless green and blue. A ventilator hissed at measured intervals. Blood products hung from two poles. An ultrasound cart sat idle near the foot of the bed screen, frozen on a gray, grainy image of damage, trying not to become disaster. He looked older than he had in Claire's memory. Of course he did. 8 years changes everyone who survives it. There was gray at his temples now, deeper cuts around the mouth, a heaviness at the jaw that came from command carried too long. But even sedated, even washed pale by blood loss and pain medication, he still had that same coiled presence. The sense that if his body permitted it, he would already be up and issuing orders. A surgeon at the bedside turned irritation already loaded in his posture at being interrupted until he saw Voss, and then Claire behind him. "This is Bennett," Voss said. The surgeon's expression sharpened. He was in his 40s, compact, dark-skinned eyes, intelligent and exhausted. He looked like someone who had been making impossible calculations for hours and had no patience left for mythology. "Dr. Elias Mercer," he said, "forward surgical lead." Claire stepped in close enough to see the wound dressing and the drainage line without yet touching anything. "Brief me." Mercer glanced once at Voss, then accepted the change in authority the way competent people did when pride became a luxury. He pointed to the scan on the monitor. Fragment entered below the left clavicular line after deflection off armor plating. Secondary path downward and medial. We controlled the gross bleeding. Drain is buying us time, not solving the problem. The piece is lodged near the pericardial sac and shifting with each cycle. We have pressure accumulation and intermittent rhythm instability. Claire leaned over the image. "How long since last scan?" 26 minutes. "Any migration since then?" "A fraction." "That is enough." Mercer looked at her, weighing speed against a certainty. "Yes." Megan moved to Claire's right without being asked. Owen took the left monitor. It happened so naturally that Mercer noticed it too. Old team geometry. Not nostalgia. Efficiency. Cross's eyes flickered under sedation, then opened. Claire felt it before she fully saw it, the same way you can feel a storm about to break by the pressure in the air. Awareness. He was fighting upward through medication and blood loss with sheer trained refusal. His gaze found her. Not confusion, not relief exactly. Recognition so immediate it almost erased the room. "You came," he said, voice rough beneath the oxygen flow. Claire did not let herself react to that. "You are in no position to sound surprised." A weak ghost of amusement moved at one corner of his mouth. Mercer stepped closer. "Colonel, conserve your strength." Cross ignored him with professional ease. His eyes stayed on Claire. "Knew you would." She looked down at the wound, then at the rhythm line marching across the screen. "You knew wrong often enough to make this interesting." That earned the smallest breath that might have been a laugh, though it cost him. His lids fell shut again. Mercer exhaled. "He has been asking for you through every sedation break." Claire reached for the chart at the foot of the bed. Handwritten notes, typed addenda, blood loss estimates, medication schedule. She flipped pages quickly, reading not only what had happened but how the team thought, where they hesitated, where they adapted, where they had almost lost him. "You have done good work," she said, without looking up. Mercer accepted it the same way he had accepted her arrival. Quietly. "We ran out of clean options." Claire turned back to the monitor and the latest scan. The old protocol would not work here. In Syria, Cross had been dying from collapse and pressure from a chest that could not hold together long enough for evacuation. This was different. The fragment sat too close to the heart wall, trapped in a terrible little geometry of motion and threat. Every beat nudged it. Every minute raised the odds of catastrophic tear. The room waited while she looked. No one rushed her. That was another sign things were already at the edge. Competent teams knew the value of silence when the right person was thinking. Claire stepped closer to the bed and placed 2 fingers gently against the intact side of Cross's chest, feeling the rise, the vibration beneath bone, the rhythm that monitors rendered into abstraction but the hand still understood more intimately. The beat was strong enough to be dangerous. Too much force against too little margin. She looked at Mercer. "You cannot pull this by the standard route. We know. You cannot leave it. We know that too. Can you get bypass here?" Mercer's expression made the answer before his voice did. "No." Can you get him airborne in this condition? Not without gambling against the same fragment on takeoff. Claire nodded once. The room clicked into place around her. Variables sorted themselves by brutality. Megan was already gloving up. Owen said, "Tell us where you want us." Mercer glanced between them. "You have worked together before." Claire set the chart down. Not in a place this clean. That earned the faintest pull at Owen's mouth. Mercer stepped aside from the table. It was not surrender. It was a professional making room for the person most likely to get the patient through the next hour. "Talk me through what you are seeing," he said. Claire kept her eyes on the wound and the image. "The fragment is too unstable for a blind pull and too close for a conventional removal without full support we do not have. If it shifts inward during extraction, he bleeds into a space we cannot rescue quickly enough. If it stays where it is, pressure continues to rise, and eventually the heart runs out of room to move." Mercer nodded slowly. "So," Claire looked up. "So we create room." For the first time since she entered, real uncertainty crossed the surgeon's face. "How?" Claire did not answer immediately. She was already moving. She scrubbed in at the sink with Megan beside her, both women, working in perfect mirrored economy. Soap. Rinse. Turn. Hold. The old rhythm came back not as memory, but as identity. She had spent years living as if this part of herself could be reduced to a line on a sealed discharge and some habits no hospital could quite smooth out. Now, with water running hot over her forearms and the hum of surgical lights rising beyond the door, the truth returned in full. You can bury a language. The tongue still remembers. Megan glanced at her while drying. "You really disappeared." Claire held out her hands for the towel. "You were ordered to let me." Megan tied her gown. "I hated that order." "So did I." They did not say Emily's name. Not yet. Some absences altered the air too much to bring into a room where someone else was trying not to die. Back at the table, Claire took her place at Cross's left side. Mercer stood opposite. Megan at her shoulder. Owen on monitors and instruments. Two younger medics hovered at the edge of the bay, silent and wide-eyed, trying to become useful without getting in the way. Claire looked at each face once. "I need quiet unless the information matters. If I ask for an instrument, do not make me ask twice. If his rhythm changes, I want it called the second it changes, not after anyone decides whether it is worth mentioning." No one objected. She bent over the field. The first incision was deliberate, not dramatic. A clean extension for access, nothing theatrical, no wasted movement. The room changed with it. Conversation stopped. Air seemed to pull tight over every surface. Claire opened tissue and measured layers using the angle of the existing wound where she could, preserving what structure remained. Blood welled dark and warm. Suction cleared it. The metallic scent rose stronger. Mercer watched her hands. "You are not following thoracic exposure." "No." "What are you following?" "The anatomy he still gets to keep." That shut down the question. She worked deeper. There was no room here for broad gestures or textbook confidence. Everything had to be small, exact, and responsive to what Cross's body allowed. She relieved localized pressure first, drawing off what fluid she could without provoking the motion she feared. The monitor steadied a fraction. Not enough, but enough to confirm the line she was taking. Owen called out blood pressure. Megan handed a fine retractor before Claire asked. Mercer adjusted suction perfectly the first time, which told Claire he was as good as his chart had suggested. Then she saw it. Not the whole fragment, just the edge. A hard glint buried in living red, pulsing with every beat. It was lodged like a threat held in place by luck and inflammation. One wrong touch and luck would leave the room. Claire went completely still. Megan felt it and stopped breathing. Mercer leaned in. "You have visual. Partial. Can you isolate it?" "Not yet." Cross's rhythm skipped once. Owen looked up. "PVC." "I heard it," Claire said. The next few minutes unfolded in inches. She built access slowly, refusing the urge to hurry simply because time was cruel. She could feel the pressure of everyone wanting progress, wanting a move large enough to call hope. But life-saving work was often the opposite of spectacle. It was patience weaponized against collapse. Cross stirred under sedation. His blood pressure dipped, recovered, then dipped again. Mercer said, "He is getting lighter." "Not too much more sedation," Claire replied. "I need the rhythm honest." "He will feel this." "He already does." Cross's eyes opened to slits. His voice came as a scrape. "Bennett." She did not look up. "Busy. Tried to find you." The words hit the table harder than any alarm had. Megan's hands tightened around the instrument she was passing. Owen's eyes flicked once toward Claire and away. Claire took the instrument and finally looked at Cross. "You can apologize after you stop trying to die in front of me." A shadow of a smile touched his mouth again, stubborn even now. Then pain cut through the sedation and his face tightened. The monitor changed. Not a skip this time, a run. Owen's voice sharpened. "Rhythm is going ugly." Claire's hand froze over the field. "Say it." "Ventricular ectopy." "He is sliding." Mercer reached for meds. "Push lidocaine." "Not yet." Cross's heartbeat stumbled into chaos. The alarm erupted. Everything in the room snapped taut. "Charge," Claire said. One of the younger medics had the paddles in Mercer's hands before the word fully landed. Claire cleared the field palms, lifted just enough to protect without obstructing. The first shock lifted Cross's body off the table in a violent arc. Nothing stable returned. Owen's next call came faster. Still bad, pressure falling. Again. Second shock. The rhythm fractured, hesitated, then dragged itself into a narrow, ugly line that at least still belonged to the living. The room inhaled together. Claire leaned back over the wound immediately. No pause. No release. She had maybe bought them minutes, maybe less. Enough only if she used them as if they were the whole world. Mercer's voice was low now, stripped to essentials. "He will not tolerate much more of this. I know." She looked again at the fragment, then at the surrounding tissue, then at the supply table where combat gauze lay stacked in foil packets beside conventional dressings. An old image flashed through her mind. Not Syria. Training. A journal article she had skimmed years ago on biologic reinforcement in fragile cardiac repair. Not applicable here. Not directly. But the principle was sound. Buffer. Separation. Temporary protection while the impossible part happened. "We need a cushion," she said. Mercer frowned. "We do not have mesh." "I am not asking for mesh." Megan was already scanning the tray. "Hemostatic gauze." Claire nodded once. 3 packs. Mercer looked at her sharply. "That is not designed for this space." "No," Claire said, "but it can buy me the one I need." One of the younger medics tore the packets and passed them over. Claire trimmed folded shaped with blood-slick fingers that somehow never slipped. She was building a barrier by feel and judgment, a temporary shield between jagged metal and the muscle trying to keep a man in this world. Mercer saw it a second before she placed it. "You are going to create an extraction corridor." "Yes." He stared at the improvised pad in her hand. "If it shifts the wrong way, he dies." Mercer held her gaze for one beat. Then he nodded. Understood. Claire eased the first layer into position with infinite care. The work became smaller than language. Pressure no greater than necessary. Angle adjusted to pulse. Wait, read, respond. The monitor became a metronome to the movement of her hands. Cross's chest rose and fell under assisted breaths. Sweat gathered beneath Claire's cap and ran cold down the back of her neck. Megan wicked blood from the field before it obscured structure. Owen called numbers in the same steady voice he had once used under gunfire. Voss stood just outside the main circle, silent as stone, watching the room with a soldier's habit of guarding the perimeter, even in places where the enemy was time itself. "Pressure holding," Owen said. "For now," Mercer muttered. Claire seated the final edge of the gauze buffer and looked at the fragment again. It had stopped kissing the heart wall with each beat. Not much, just enough. A few millimeters of mercy manufactured out of training, memory, and refusal. She exhaled once. Fine clamp. Megan placed it into her hand. The metal settled against Claire's fingers like an old promise. She adjusted her stance, leaned in over the open wound, and began the extraction. She did not pull immediately. First, she tested the fragment with the gentlest pressure possible, reading resistance through steel and tissue, the way another person might read a pulse. It shifted less than she feared and more than she liked. The gauze buffer held. Barely. Cross's heartbeat tapped against the field with terrible steadiness, each contraction reminding everyone in the room that the difference between success and blood flooding the cavity was smaller than the width of a fingernail. Claire adjusted her grip. "On my count," she said. No one answered. They were already with her. She timed the first movement to the end of a beat, not the beginning. Less force against the wall. Less chance of tearing on the strongest contraction. The fragment slid a fraction. The monitor gave a sharp complaint. Owen's head snapped up. "Pressure dipping," expected, Claire said. Another breath from the ventilator. Another heartbeat. Another measured pull. This time the metal moved farther. Mercer leaned in over the opposite side of the field suction, steady voice low and stripped of everything but necessity. "You have it." "Not yet." Claire did not believe in victory until the problem was off the table and the patient still had color. Cross's rhythm stuttered. Megan said quietly, "Come on, Colonel." Claire went again. Not harder, cleaner. She changed the angle by less than a degree and felt the resistance given a long, ugly glide that seemed to travel from her fingertips up into her shoulders. Then the fragment came free all at once, slick with blood and bright under the lights. For half a second, nobody in the room breathed. Then Claire handed the metal off without looking at it and went back in before Triumph could get anyone killed. Pack. Megan was already there. Cautery. Mercer placed it into Claire's palm like he had worked beside her for years. The cavity tried to bloom red, but the buffer had done what she needed it to do. There was bleeding, yes, but not the kind that erased all choices at once. She sealed one point, compressed another layered pressure where tissue still had a chance to cooperate. Owen called improving pressure. The rhythm steadied. The line on the monitor rounded into something recognizably human again. Claire did not stop. She closed as much as she could, not with the neatness of a civilian operating room, but with the ruthless practicality of a field save meant to hold until the next set of hands could take over with more equipment and more time. She tied off the last suture, checked the drain, watched the chest rise with less resistance, and finally stepped back. Cross kept breathing. The room stayed silent for a long moment, each person confirming the same impossible thing in private before trusting it out loud. The only sounds were the ventilator, the monitor, and the soft metallic clink of an instrument settling into a tray. Owen let out a breath that trembled at the end. "Well," he said, voice rough, "that was disgusting." Megan laughed once, hand pressed hard to her mask. It sounded too close to crying to be anything else. Mercer looked down at the extracted fragment where it sat in a kidney dish on the tray. Then he looked at Claire. He had stopped seeing legend somewhere in the middle of the procedure. What remained now was the regard one craftsman gives another after watching them do something terrible and exact. "That needs documenting immediately," he said. Claire stripped off her gloves. The shake started only then. Not visible to everyone maybe, but there. A fine, violent tremor in the hands that had just held a life in place. Voss stepped forward from the edge of the room. "The training command will want the full sequence." Mercer nodded. "They're going to ask what to call it." Claire looked at the dish holding the metal that had nearly torn Nathan Cross open from the inside. Then she looked at the man himself, pale and sedated under the lights, alive for reasons no policy manual would ever admit were legitimate. For years, she had watched the world function as if her name were detachable from what her hands had done. She had made a life around that absence, a decent one in places, quiet, useful, narrow enough to avoid asking what had been taken. Now she stood in a military bay with blood cooling on her forearms, while a room full of witnesses waited for her to identify the thing they had all just seen. "Bennett," she said. Mercer frowned slightly. "Your last name?" "The Bennett method." No one argued. Megan picked up the fragment tray with careful fingers. About time. Claire did not answer. She was too tired to know what to do with vindication when it arrived in the middle of a trauma bay. Cross moved under sedation. His eyelids lifted a fraction. The medication had not fully conquered the stubbornness in him. It probably never would. "Bennett," he murmured. Claire went back to the bedside despite herself. "You are still here," he said, voice barely shaped. "Yes?" His gaze found her through the haze. "Told them." "I know. Not enough." "No," Claire said. It was not. His eyes closed again, but his mouth moved around one last phrase. "Still tried." She stood there another second, looking at the face of a man who had once been command, then patient, then ghost, then problem, and was now simply a tired body being kept in the world 1 hour at a time. Mercer gave a soft signal to the recovery team. The room began to move again. Dressings were secured. The litter was brought alongside. Lines were checked. The bay shifted from miracle to maintenance, which was how good teams survived their own adrenaline. Megan touched Claire's elbow lightly. "Come on, you need water." Claire let herself be led into the adjoining scrub room, where the bright white of the operating space gave way to the duller, practical light of sinks and lockers. She braced both hands on the stainless steel counter and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked older than she had that morning in Whitaker's office. That was ridiculous. It had been 1 day, less than 1 day. Yet the face staring back seemed separated from sunrise by years rather than hours. There was dried blood at her collar. Sweat had pasted short strands of hair to her temples. Her eyes had that familiar post-trauma clarity she hated, the kind that felt almost supernatural, until the crash came and reminded you it was just chemistry and cost. Megan handed her a bottle of water and leaned against the opposite wall. "I heard rumors," Megan said. "I heard you went civilian. Then that you were teaching. Then that you moved states, then nothing." Claire twisted the cap and drank half the bottle without stopping. "Most of that is true." Megan studied her face. "You really never contacted anyone." "I signed papers that made it very clear what would happen if I did. They made us sign papers, too. Different ones." Claire wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "Did you stay?" Megan gave a short, humorless laugh. "A while. Long enough to be useful. Long enough to hate the sound of my own boots in the morning." She looked down. "Owen rotated out, came back in a contractor role, then ended up here. I bounced between units until medical command stole me for trauma instruction. And Emily." The room changed. Megan let the silence stand before answering. "We got the sanitized version. Killed in action. Citation delayed. Family informed under restricted terms. You know how they do it." Claire nodded once. Megan looked at her hard. "Her name is on a wall at your hospital." Claire's grip tightened around the bottle. "You knew. I found out 2 months ago. Someone from command flagged a regional memorial partnership, thought the name was a mistake. It was not a mistake." "Who put it there?" Megan shook her head. "Nobody told me. But it traveled through channels that do not usually move unless someone senior keeps touching the file." Cross Claire thought but did not say. Megan read something in her face and said quietly, "He never let it go." Claire stared at the sink drain while water from her forearm spiraled pink around the metal grate. "He should have let me stay buried." Megan's expression sharpened. "You do not mean that." "Yes," Claire said. "I do. No." Claire turned toward her, then, too tired to soften the truth. "I built a life where nobody died because a classified mission landed on my kitchen table. I worked 12-hour shifts, paid rent, learned the names of patients' grandkids, and went home to an apartment where nobody knocked on the door with a flag. That matters." Megan held her gaze. "So does this." Claire looked away first. By the time she stepped outside the scrub room, dawn had become full morning, and the base had settled into the strange after rhythm that follows a major save. Not calm, never calm, just a redistributed urgency. Somewhere nearby, another team shouted for plasma. A generator coughed and caught. The world had room for only brief astonishment before the next body demanded attention. Cross was moved to a higher support unit for continued monitoring. Mercer insisted on walking beside the bed himself. Claire went with them down the corridor because she could not yet trust her own hands to do anything except stay near the consequence of what they had just done. At the ICU door, Mercer stopped and turned toward her. "You should know something," he said. Claire waited. "I do not care what politics wrapped around your history. I have watched a lot of people operate under pressure. What you did in there was not luck, and it was not recklessness." Claire looked at him for a moment. In another life, with another kind of day behind her, she might have said thank you. Instead, she nodded once. "You kept him alive long enough for me to try." Mercer accepted that answer. "I will take it." He disappeared through the ICU doors with the bed. Voss remained in the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that suggested he did not know whether to stand at ease or stand guard. "They have transport ready when you are done here," he said. Claire frowned. Done with what? Recovery briefing, medical documentation, then a secure debrief in Virginia. She laughed softly. "Of course." Voss did not smile. "That is not punishment. It rarely announces itself as such." He let that pass. "They want to talk to you while the chain is hot." Claire could feel the exhaustion coming now, not as sleepiness, as subtraction. Muscles losing charge, thoughts thickening at the edges, the body presenting its bill. "When do I leave?" "As soon as Cross is stable enough that you will believe he will stay that way." Claire looked through the ICU window. Mercer and 2 nurses worked around the bed with efficient calm. Monitors flashed. Cross lay motionless except for the rise and fall of the ventilator. "Then I leave later." Voss nodded. "I thought you might say that." She stayed at the base for 3 days. The first passed in fragments. A bunk room she did not remember entering. Coffee that tasted like scorched metal. A debrief with Trauma Command in which she reconstructed every movement of the procedure while a young officer typed with reverent terror, trying not to miss a word. Mercer interrupted twice to clarify physiology, and once to object to a phrase he said was too informal for doctrine. Claire looked at him and said he was dying ugly, and I made space for the heart to stop losing the argument. Write that in cleaner language if it helps you sleep. Owen laughed so hard he had to step out of the room. The second day, Cross came off deeper sedation and demanded to sit up before anyone with a license agreed that was a good idea. Claire found him in the ICU, propped halfway against Pillow's color, returning in stubborn increments, one hand gripping the edge of the blanket as if restraint itself had become a personal insult. "You look terrible," she said. He turned his head toward the voice and smiled with only half his mouth because the rest of him was too occupied hurting. "I have looked worse. That is true." There were no witnesses close enough to hear them clearly. Mercer had learned when not to hover. Voss stood outside the glass talking to someone on a secure phone. The room held only the low murmur of machines and the privacy of people too tired for ceremony. Cross's gaze stayed on her. "They found you because of Phoenix," he said. "Yes. I'm sorry about that. The hospital or the helicopters?" A faint shadow of humor touched his eyes. "Both." Claire stood at the foot of the bed with her hands in the pockets of borrowed fatigues someone had found for her after her scrubs were cut away and bagged as evidence of the procedure. "They named it after you," Cross said. "I named it after me." "Good." He shut his eyes briefly, then opened them again with effort. "They buried your report. They could not bury the outcomes. I kept copies where I could, moved pieces around, pushed from inside. Not enough, never enough." Claire watched the monitor reflect green across the clear plastic of his oxygen line. "I believed they gave you my work, and you let them." Cross looked at her without defensiveness. That made it worse. "They gave me the wrapper it came in," he said. "I spent 8 years trying to tear it off." She let that sit. It did not restore anything. It did not cancel the discharge, the silence the year she spent pretending old skills were just instincts with no origin story. But it did shift the shape of one wound. Not close it. Shift it. Emily's name is in Phoenix, she said. He nodded once. I made sure of it. Claire stared at him. Why? Because if the mission stayed black forever, she stayed black forever. I could not fix your file, not cleanly, but I could put one true thing where the world would have to look at it. Claire looked away to the window. You used her name to pull me out. No, Cross said quietly. I used her name because she should be remembered. The rest happened because I was out of time. When Claire left the room, she still did not know whether she was angrier at him for the tactic or grateful for the honesty. On the third day, a transport aircraft took her east. No ceremony, no send-off. Voss escorted her to the tarmac with a folder sealed under classification tabs and enough signatures to remind her how institutions protected themselves even when they were trying to apologize. Cross remained behind one more day for monitoring. Megan hugged her once. Owen gave her a folded page with a phone number written on it and said, "Use it this decade." Mercer only shook her hand and said, "Do not let them turn you into a symbol before they answer for what they did." The flight to Virginia was quieter than the one from Phoenix. No trauma image glowing in her lap. No active bleed waiting at the other end. Just a gray sky beyond the oval windows and the peculiar emptiness that follows prolonged danger. Claire spent most of it staring at the tray table without seeing it replaying hand motions in reverse until they slowed enough to stop feeling like electricity. At Arlington, they put her in a black SUV with tinted windows and no conversation. The city passed in clean official lines, white stone, flags, guarded entries, the architecture of decision-making. The building itself was all concrete badge readers and carpet that swallowed footsteps. Claire moved through security checkpoints under escort, her civilian ID temporarily replaced by a visitor credential that reduced her to a barcode and a last name. No one told her exactly who was waiting upstairs. She knew the type before the elevator doors opened. The briefing room was too large for sincerity. A long table. Wall screens alive with secure connections. Uniforms heavy with stars and ribbons. Medical command. Legal. Operational leadership. The sort of gathering institutions assembled when truth had become expensive and could no longer be settled by burying one person's file. Claire entered in plain clothes someone had delivered to the base the day before. Dark slacks, white shirt, no insignia, no visible rank. It pleased her more than she expected that she looked like the least important person in the room. Every face turned. A silver-haired major general at the head of the table stood as she approached. He had the posture of a man who had spent decades being obeyed and had recently learned that command did not erase shame. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "thank you for coming." Claire stopped beside the only empty chair. I was escorted. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The general did not. "Yes," he said, "you were." He gestured to the chair. She sat. He remained standing. 8 years ago, you served as a combat medic attached to Raven 9 during Operation Ash Lantern. During that operation, you improvised a life-saving thoracic intervention that directly resulted in Colonel Nathan Cross surviving to evacuation and in 3 additional personnel reaching higher care alive. You submitted an after-action medical report and procedural notes. Those documents were suppressed as part of a broader classification response to an intelligence compromise and command failure. The room was silent enough for Claire to hear the faint fan noise behind the wall screens. The general continued. Your work was reviewed, adapted, and distributed through Special Operations Trauma Doctrine without your name attached. That was wrong. He did not rush the sentence. He did not soften it with legal language. Claire gave him that much credit. On one of the wall screens, slides appeared. Training images. Revised field manuals. Case reports, survival data, her method dressed in military formatting and institutional fonts. Verified saves directly attributable to the protocol stand at 247, the general said. Likely more. Those are only the cases we can certify cleanly. Claire looked at the screen and felt nothing simple. Not pride, not relief. Something more difficult. The psychic whiplash of seeing a theft mature into evidence that people lived because of it. We cannot give you back the years between then and now, the general said. We can acknowledge what happened, we can correct the record, and we can make an offer. He sat then, and another officer slid a folder toward Claire. She opened it. Reinstatement at the rank of captain. Back compensation. Formal commendation. A new role inside combat medical innovation with authority over doctrine development, field training, integration, and procedural review. The language was polished, careful, generous in the way institutions become generous when they realize someone they discarded has become too valuable to ignore. Claire closed the folder. Before she could speak, movement near the wall drew her attention. A civilian man in a dark suit stood from a chair she had not noticed among the uniformed officials. Thomas Whitaker. For a second, the room fractured strangely around that fact. Phoenix. The cold office, termination paper folded into a scrub pocket. His voice saying legal exposure while a woman breathed because Claire had moved faster than the chain of approval. Whitaker looked smaller here. Not physically. Structurally. The confidence of hospital administration did not travel well into rooms filled with people who had decided national secrets and casualty reports. He cleared his throat and Claire saw that his collar was damp. Ms. Bennett, he began. St. Catherine. Regional has become aware of the extraordinary service history and medical contribution that informed your recent clinical judgment. The phrase was so bloodless it almost impressed her. Whitaker kept going because backing out would have required more courage than he possessed. The hospital would like to extend an offer of immediate reinstatement. In addition, pending board approval, we are prepared to appoint you head of emergency medicine with expanded discretionary authority, a research budget, and full institutional support. No one in the room moved. Whitaker looked directly at Claire now, trying for sincerity and landing on polished desperation. We did not understand the full context of your background. Claire stood. The chair legs made a small, clean sound against the floor. It silenced what little air remained in the room. She looked at Whitaker for a long moment before speaking. You fired me because a patient lived in a way your paperwork did not authorize. Whitaker's face tightened. That is not an accurate characterization. It is exact. He glanced toward the generals as if hoping authority might intervene and rescue him from the person he had misjudged. None of them did. You acted outside policy, he said, but there was no weight behind it now. Claire took one step toward him. I acted before your policy turned a woman into a body. Whitaker opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. St. Catherine values initiative. Claire's laugh was soft and merciless. Number St. Catherine values initiative after someone in a more expensive room validates it. The words landed hard enough that several people at the table looked away. Whitaker's voice thinned. We are trying to make this right. Claire held his gaze. No, you are trying not to be remembered correctly. Color rose in his face. For one brief second, she saw the office version of him trying to reassemble itself. The man who relied on hierarchy and clean language, and the assumption that his version of events would become official if repeated often enough. The room was wrong for that man. There was too much rank here and too much evidence. She turned from him before he could recover and faced the table. The general watched her with the wary stillness of someone who knew the moment had shifted beyond administrative management. Ms. Bennett, he said carefully, the offer stands. Claire placed one hand lightly on the closed folder in front of her. I appreciate the apology, she said. I appreciate the corrected record and the attempt to repair it. The general inclined his head. But I am not coming back. A subtle reaction moved around the room. Not outrage. Surprise. Disbelief from people unused to hearing no after a formal offer backed by rank money and public honor. The general spoke first. May I ask why? Claire looked at the wall screens. The statistics, the doctrine pages, the polished proof of all the ways systems absorb the labor of people they do not know how to respect while it is happening. Because I am not interested in spending the rest of my life as the exception that makes your culture feel generous. The room stayed very still. Claire continued, her voice level almost conversational. There are emergency nurses in small hospitals all over this country making decisions with too few resources and too many administrators. There are medics in field units who know what is wrong before the imaging catches up. There are paramedics, trauma techs, and rural teams who are told to wait when waiting is just another word for losing. You do not need me, back in uniform, as a symbol that the institution eventually got one thing right. The general listened without interruption. You need training that respects real judgment, Claire said. Cross-discipline, civilian and military. Protocol that leaves room for reality. And you need a documentation culture that does not steal from the person closest to the wound. Nobody wrote that down in front of her, but she knew they would afterward. She tapped the folder once. If you want to repair something, fund scholarships for field and emergency responders who do not have access to advanced trauma training. Open the procedural archive where you can. Put my name back where it belongs in the doctrine package. And stop teaching innovation as if it only counts when someone with rank repeats it. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Working silence. Then the general nodded slowly. That is a fair set of conditions. Whitaker shifted as if to speak again. Claire did not look at him. She had already spent more attention on him than he had earned. The general folded his hands. If we agree to those terms, would you advise the program from outside active service? Claire thought of the ICU room in Arizona. Megan at the sink. Owen laughing in the debrief. Caleb on a gravel shoulder with no one arriving in time. Brooke at the nurse's station, furious and helpless, as soldiers took Claire down a stairwell. Helen Mercer gasping back into focus while a fellow begged for cleaner imaging. She thought of every place where time outran permission. Yes, she said, from outside. The general nodded once more. Something in his expression softened not into warmth, but into respect that had finally found the right shape. Then we will proceed that way. Whitaker sat down without being dismissed, which was the closest thing to defeat Claire had ever seen him wear honestly. The meeting continued for another hour. Legal language. Disclosure boundaries. The mechanics of file correction. Names of offices that would coordinate with names of offices that had once buried things. Claire answered when needed and stayed silent when the room drifted toward a self-congratulation. By the time the folder was repacked and the screens went dark, she was operating on the last clear reserves of energy. Outside the building, late afternoon sun reflected off government glass and turned the pavement white. A young captain from protocol offered to arrange a car. Claire said she would walk to the curb herself. He looked startled but stood aside. She stepped into the open air and felt the world loosen by a fraction. Traffic moved. A siren sounded somewhere distant and ordinary. Flags snapped above the building line. The city continued without knowing what had just been corrected in a secure room overhead. Her phone vibrated in her bag. A text from Brooke. Are you alive? Claire stood on the sidewalk, read it twice, and finally let herself smile. Yes. A second bubble appeared almost immediately. Good. Helen Mercer asked for you today. Claire looked out at the line of cars easing through the intersection. Tell her she scared us all. Brooke replied with a single line. She said you looked like you knew exactly what to do. Claire slid the phone back into her bag and lifted a hand to flag the first taxi in line. The taxi pulled away from the curb and Claire leaned back against cracked vinyl that smelled faintly of heat and old air freshener. Washington slid past in polished stone and moving shadows all those government facades built to suggest permanence. She watched them through the glass without really seeing them. Her body had crossed too many thresholds in too few days for any single room to keep meaning. Whitaker's office. The trauma bay at Fort Huachuca. The briefing room in Arlington. Each place had tried in its own way to define what she was worth. None of them had the right. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Airport. Yes. Business trip. Claire looked out the window at a cyclist threading through traffic with one hand on the bars and one hand raised against the glare. Something like that. He nodded, satisfied enough with the answer. The city kept moving. By the time the plane touched down in Phoenix that evening, the light had gone honey-colored over the desert, and the air coming off the jet bridge carried that familiar dry warmth that always felt a little like opening an oven and finding home inside it anyway. Claire walked through the terminal with a small duffel over one shoulder and no clear idea what came next, which was unusual for her. Most of her life had been built around the next urgent thing, the next patient, the next transport, the next handoff. Even combat medicine, for all its chaos, had offered brutal clarity. Someone was hurt. Time was short. Act now. This was different. There was no active bleed to stop. No monitor sounding an alarm. Just the long echo after impact and the strange open space left behind when a life gets broken apart and then handed back to you in a shape you no longer want. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. One bedroom, cheap blinds, a couch she had promised herself she would replace for 2 years and never did. The coffee mug still in the sink from before dawn. The folded clean laundry she had not put away because she had believed there would be a normal evening after that shift. On the kitchen counter sat her hospital access badge, where she had dropped it after getting home from Fort Huachuca before being collected again by officers in dress uniform and driven east. The plastic face caught the overhead light. Claire Bennett, RN, St. Catherine Regional Medical Center. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, opened the junk drawer beside the stove and dropped it in among dead batteries, takeout menus, loose screws, and the spare key her brother had once insisted every apartment needed. The next morning, she woke before sunrise without an alarm and lay in bed listening to the silence. No overhead pages. No rotor wash. No hallway wheels. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rush of traffic 4 stories down. Her body did not trust it. Rest after a crisis had always felt suspicious, as if calm were just another kind of disguise. Her phone rang at 6:14. Cross. She stared at the name for a beat before answering. You should still be in recovery. His voice came through rougher than usual, but steady. And good morning to you. Claire sat up against the headboard. Did Mercer authorize this call? Mercer has opinions. I have a phone. That almost sounded like the old Cross. Not the man on the trauma table, but the one who had once walked into bad situations with a face calm enough to make everyone else believe the map still applied. How are you? Alive. That is not the same thing. No, he said, it is not. She waited. There was a brief silence on the line, not awkward, just occupied. Cross had never filled space for comfort. He spoke when there was purpose behind it. They accepted your terms, he said. Claire looked at the blinds glowing pale gold with the first edge of morning. That was fast. It was overdue. They are really opening the archive. Partially. Enough to establish the line of authorship and training origin. Enough to move funding where you wanted it. Claire let that settle. Who pushed it? Cross gave a dry breath that might have been a laugh. Would you like the official answer or the useful one? The useful one. I did. Mercer did. A few people in Trauma Command who are tired of pretending good ideas arrive only after they have been laundered through rank. And one major general who would rather fix this now than explain later why he did not. Claire swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. And what do they think I'm going to do with it? Cross did not hesitate. They think you are going to build something they should have built years ago. The apartment was cold under her bare feet. She crossed to the kitchen and started the coffee maker without really deciding to. And what do you think? I think he said you already know what shape it needs. That was the problem. He was right. Over the next 3 weeks, her life became a sequence of rooms with whiteboards. Military liaisons. Civilian trauma educators. Grant administrators who had never spent 10 minutes inside an overcrowded emergency department, but knew how to move money if the right signatures aligned. rural hospital directors joining by video call from Idaho, New Mexico, West Texas, and parts of Colorado where snow and distance still turned ambulance response into a gamble. Flight medics, Army instructors, paramedic chiefs, a Navajo Nation emergency coordinator who spoke so quietly at first that the room had to lean in, then held every person there for 20 minutes with the plain truth of what delayed care looked like on roads too dark and too far apart. Claire said little in the first meetings. She listened. That surprised people. They expected a restored hero, maybe, a sharp voice and a list of demands. Instead, they got a woman with a legal pad, a strong coffee, and an unnerving habit of wading through everyone's polished presentation until the real problem appeared underneath it. One contractor from a private simulation company spent 10 minutes explaining the value of high-fidelity training environments before Claire asked him if any of his proposed modules included a generator failure, an empty supply shelf, or a family member screaming in the doorway, while one person on the team still needed to calculate dosage under pressure. He blinked. No, Claire closed his brochure. Then your fidelity is decorative. By the fourth meeting, people had stopped underestimating her. Colorado Springs emerged less as a plan than as a practical answer. Central enough for travel, close enough to military medical infrastructure without being trapped inside it. Civilian partnerships available. Training space adaptable. Grants easier to route through a new nonprofit educational model than through any one hospital system with its own politics and liabilities. The name came later, not from branding consultants, not from strategic communications staff, from Brooke. They were sitting in a diner near St. Catherine after Claire's first public visit back to Phoenix. Not to work, to speak with the patient. Helen Mercer was upright now, thinner than before color returned, a scarf tied over carefully brushed hair. Her daughter sat beside her with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she never lifted. They had wanted to thank Claire in person. Claire had tried to refuse, then accepted because some debts deserve a face. Helen had looked at her for a long moment before saying, "I do not remember much, but I remember your voice." Claire had smiled and told her that was probably for the best. Helen shook her head. "No, I remember thinking that if you sounded that calm, I was not allowed to leave." Afterward, Claire and Brooke had sat in the diner booth, watching sunlight stripe the Formica table, while the waitress refilled coffee neither of them really needed. "So what are you calling the place?" Brooke asked. Claire stirred cream into her cup. "It is a training institute, not a place." Brooke rolled her eyes. "Fine. What are you calling the institute?" Claire looked out the window at the hospital across the street. Tall glass. Clean lines. A building full of people doing hard work inside systems that often made hard work harder. "I have not decided." Brooke tore a packet of sweetener open and dumped it in with unnecessary force. "Do not let one of those boardroom people name it. You will end up with something like Center for Advanced Critical Synergy." Claire laughed despite herself. "That sounds expensive. It sounds criminal." Brooke pointed her spoon at her. "Call it something honest." Claire lifted an eyebrow. "Such as?" Brooke did not even pause. "Bennett Critical Response Institute." Claire stared at her. Brooke shrugged. "It says exactly what it is. And before you make that face, I am not asking whether you are comfortable with your own name. You are past that." The waitress came by and topped off both cups. When she left, Claire looked down at the coffee, then back toward the hospital. Brooke was right. She hated that Brooke was right. 3 months later, the first shipment arrived in Colorado Springs. Simulation mannequins, airway trainers, portable monitors, trauma kits, donor cots, field stretchers, whiteboards still wrapped in plastic. Boxes of old-fashioned paper chart forms Claire insisted on keeping because electronics failed, and hands still had to remember what mattered when they did. The building was an old aerospace warehouse on the edge of an industrial corridor close enough to the mountains that morning light fell blue across the lot in winter. Inside it had high ceilings, concrete floors, and the kind of raw echo that made every voice sound temporary, until enough people and purpose filled the space. On the first day, Claire unlocked the doors alone. She stood in the center of the empty training bay with a keyring in one hand and silence all around her. Fresh paint, dust motes turning in slanted light. An American flag somebody from facilities had hung too high and too small in the corner. Fold-out chairs stacked against the far wall. Nothing polished, nothing ceremonial, just a shell waiting to become useful. She walked the perimeter slowly. Bay 1 would be rural emergency intake. Bay 2 field trauma under constrained conditions. Bay 3 cardiac and thoracic emergencies with variable resource settings. The back offices would stay small. She had no intention of building a bureaucracy and then spending her life feeding it. The first framed item on the wall was not a diploma or a commendation. It was the Raven 9 patch, black raven over 9 stars. She held it in both hands before hanging it herself in the small auditorium near the entrance. Beneath it, on a brushed metal plate, the engraver had etched words she almost made them shorten and finally let stand. Captain Claire Bennett, Combat Medic, Founder, Bennett Critical Response Institute. She stepped back and looked at it. Not pride exactly. Something quieter and more durable. Alignment, maybe. The sense of a life no longer split into the acceptable name and the hidden one. Applications came faster than the Institute was ready for them. Nurses from trauma centers in Chicago and Houston, medics from Army posts and reserve units, paramedics from Montana, flight nurses from Alaska, 2 emergency physicians from reservation hospitals, 1 firefighter from rural Oklahoma who wrote in his statement that he was tired of getting to people with just enough gear to know what he was missing and not enough training to improvise safely when the textbook answer lived 60 miles away. Claire read every application herself, not because she distrusted staff. There was hardly any staff yet. A program coordinator named Denise, who had once run training for a major trauma network and possessed the cold-eyed competence of a woman impossible to bluff. A retired supply sergeant who could make $10,000 of equipment behave like 25. A part-time administrator with a toddler at home and a terrifying ability to find line-item waste inside any budget, mostly because Claire wanted to know who was coming through the door and why. The first class was capped at 200. Military medics in uniform sat beside civilian nurses in scrubs and polo shirts. Paramedics with county patches. Residents still carrying the thin-skinned intensity of recent training. 1 emergency physician with 30 years in a mountain town and hands weathered like old leather. They gathered in the auditorium under the Raven 9 patch coffee cups in hand, notebooks open on their laps, all carrying some version of the same expression. Hope mixed with doubt. The look of people who had come because something in their current system no longer matched the reality they faced. Claire stood at the podium in jeans boots and a dark button-down shirt with the Institute logo stitched over the pocket. No medals, no rank on display, no attempt to dramatize why the room existed. She let the murmur settle on its own. Then she said, "This is not a school for heroes." The room went still. "It is not a school for cowboys either. If that is what you came for, you can save us both time and leave now." Nobody moved. Claire walked out from behind the podium and into the aisle. This place exists because there are moments when protocol runs out before the patient does. What you do next should not be panic ego or improvisation for the sake of feeling brave. It should be judgment built on repetition anatomy, team discipline, and the willingness to act before delay becomes its own injury. Pence started moving. Good, she thought. For the next 3 hours, she taught without performing. That was one of the things that separated truly competent people from those who merely knew how to command attention. She did not make herself the center of every story. She made the decision point the center. What the body was doing, what the room was missing, what tools remained, what errors of pride got people killed, what kinds of intuition were real and what kinds were just anxiety wearing a confident face. She moved from thoracic emergencies to hemorrhage control, to reading silent deterioration before machines announced it. She had them repeat hand placements until wrists ached. She stopped simulations mid-motion to ask who in the room had noticed the patient was actually tiring 5 minutes before the oxygen drop. Sometimes the person who saw it was the most junior. Sometimes it was a paramedic from Nebraska who had worked 6 winters on icy roads and knew the look of a body preparing to quit. During the first break, the questions formed a line. A young ICU nurse from Atlanta asked, "How do you know when instinct is earned and when it is just fear moving fast?" Claire took a sip of coffee. Fear is loud and urgent about you. Earned instinct is quiet and specific about the patient. The nurse wrote that down so fast she nearly tore the page. A combat medic from Fort Carson asked, "What if command says hold and everything in the room says move?" Claire looked at the patch on his shoulder, then back at his face. Then know your rationale well enough to own it in writing after. A paramedic from New Mexico said, "How do you keep from freezing when everyone starts looking at you?" Claire remembered Cross on the ground in Syria, Helen Mercer on the gurney in Phoenix, the briefing room in Arlington, Brooke watching soldiers take her away. "You pick one useful thing," she said. Then the next one. Freeze usually comes from trying to hold the whole disaster in your head at once. By the end of the day, the auditorium smelled like coffee-dry erase ink and concentration. Students were not leaning back anymore. They were leaning in. The institute grew by doing real work instead of trying to look impressive. A rural trauma immersion course launched in month 2. A joint civilian-military thoracic response workshop in month 3. Scholarships funded from the Arlington Agreement quietly moved responders through the program who never could have afforded it otherwise. Claire insisted that the money go first to people serving low-resource regions and understaffed systems. Every spreadsheet argument against that lost. Then Cross retired. He arrived on a gray Monday morning in a dark pickup that looked too ordinary for a man who had spent most of his life being delivered by government vehicles and mission timelines. He got out slower than he would have liked, one hand braced briefly on the doorframe before he straightened. Recovery had restored strength, but not all of what age and injury had taken. He wore jeans, a faded blue shirt, and the expression of a man who had spent 28 years in uniform and was still unsure whether not wearing it counted as freedom or simply a different kind of responsibility. Claire was in the equipment bay, arguing with the retired supply sergeant about whether cracked training chest plates should be patched or replaced when Denise appeared at the doorway. "There is a colonel here for you." Claire looked up. Former colonel. Denise smiled slightly. He did not lead with that. Claire stepped into the corridor and saw him waiting under the Raven 9 patch in the auditorium entrance, one hand in his pocket, taking in the room with careful attention. Students were filtering between stations down the hall. A trauma mannequin lay half-opened on a wheeled table under bright lights. Somewhere in the back bay, somebody shouted for another suction canister. Cross turned at the sound of her boots. "So this is what no looks like." Claire stopped in front of him. "This is what useful looks like when nobody keeps trying to polish it." He glanced toward the patch on the wall, then the institute name below it. "You hung the old unit before your own title." Yes, Emily would have approved. Claire studied his face. Retirement had not softened him. It had made him more legible. The lines were all still there, but without active command covering them, the wear showed more honestly. "You wrote that letter," she said. "I did." The letter had arrived 2 months earlier, handwritten and brief. "I am retiring next month. You are building the right thing. If there is room for a man who knows what institutions do to truth and what field leadership costs, I would rather spend the rest of my working life teaching than attending ceremonies." Claire had called him once after reading it. "You hate public speaking," she had said. Cross replied, "I hate bad public speaking." Now he stood in the institute lobby with Colorado light through the windows and looked for the first time in all the years she had known him like a man asking rather than assigning. "There is room," Claire said, "on one condition." His mouth shifted slightly. "Of course there is. You leave rank at the door." He looked up at the patch again. "Done." She jerked her head toward the back hall. "Then come meet the students." He followed her into Bay 2, where a group of medics were resetting a field simulation around a vehicle extraction platform. Conversations faltered as faces turned, and people recognized him, some from old command briefings, some from retirement articles, some from the kind of military rumor network that preserved certain names long after the official version had been filed. Claire did not introduce him with fanfare. "This is Nathan Cross," she said. "He is here to teach leadership under constrained conditions and how not to become useless the minute the plan stops behaving." That got a laugh from the room. Cross looked at her. "That is my formal title now, if you do well." He stepped forward and began asking students where they were from, what kinds of calls they handled, how often they were short-staffed, how often they had to make decisions before a doctor arrived, before air transport arrived, before enough daylight arrived. He was good at it, better than he had ever been in rooms full of polished officers. Here, stripped of theater, his attention sharpened into something direct and generous. Claire watched from the edge of the bay as he crouched beside a young medic from Tennessee and said, "Do not tell me what the protocol book says first. Tell me what the ground gave you." Something in her chest loosened. That evening, after the building emptied and the lights dimmed to their night settings, Claire stood alone in her office with the window open to the cooling air. Colorado Springs spread below in bands of amber and white mountains, dark beyond it all. On her desk were student evaluation supply invoices and a handwritten note from Helen Mercer tucked into the corner of the bulletin board. "Thank you for not waiting." A helicopter crossed the sky at a distance, its lights moving steady over the city. Months ago, that sound would have tightened every muscle in her body before thought caught up. It would have dragged the desert up from whatever grave she had packed it into and pressed it against the inside of her ribs. Now she only listened, not because the past had gone quiet, because it no longer arrived as command. Below her office window in the shadowed training bay, mannequins waited on wheeled cots. Whiteboards still held the day's diagrams. One station had been left half-set for tomorrow, a thoracic drill with supplies laid out in neat rows by a student who had finally learned that preparation was not the opposite of improvisation, but its foundation. Claire rested one hand on the windowsill and looked down at the place she had built from everything that once tried to erase her. Not a hospital, not a unit, not an apology. A working room where judgment could be taught without shame, and where no one had to pretend the rules covered every wound. She turned off the light in her office, left the door open behind her, and walked back toward the training floor, where morning would come early and somebody somewhere in the next class would learn the exact skill that kept another stranger breathing long enough to make it home.